That said, you're thinking about the F-35, the different variants, the B and the C. Obviously, the F-35 across the board, all three variants are much more similar than they are different. They're pretty much identical in terms of capability. Couple variations, but the B definitely had some. I wouldn't even call them limitations, but they had some very specific requirements that forced a couple things onto the airplane itself. And when if you take the B and the C, the two variants that the Marine Corps flies, and you put them side by side, certainly on paper, you get some great advantage with the C.
You did pretty well, landed in the Hornet. Let's talk about your first kind of Hornet tour, what that was like, especially in that time frame.
Yeah.
What was that like?
Yeah, and the Hornet for me was the plane. I was grew up around a Marine base. The Hornet showed up. The Blue Angels started flying Hornets. I remember as a kid they called it the Star Wars airplane because it was the first jet that had the glass cockpit and everything. So I always dreamed about being a Hornet pilot. And at some point, around Top Gun comes out, I pieced it together that Marines flew Hornets off carriers. So that was kind of the goal. From I just wanted to fly Hornets off the ship, and I ended up, finishing all flight training, got into a West Coast Hornet squadron. El Toro had moved down to Miramar by that time, so I flew at El Toro in the Hornet. I was the last student to fly an F-18 at El Toro, and moved the squadron down to Miramar and got stationed in a West Coast Hornet squadron out of San Diego. And my first tour, first 4 years, first two deployments are all as a Marine stationed in Miramar, but flying off Navy carriers. And hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of carrier landings and two full workups, two full deployments, Iraq and Afghanistan. It was a pretty wild time, man. It was pretty crazy.
It's cool to hear that full circle. I would like to dig into that just a little
Yeah.
bit in some of those deployments. But one aspect you could educate me on in marine aviation, one like so I know the Marines operating off the boat in the Hornet up until a certain point, but that went away.
Yeah.
And now, obviously, we got the F-35B operating off that, but then also it seems like the Marines are pivoting to the F-35C, buying more variants of the F-35C. It's kind of going back to that traditional, I guess, naval aviation,
Yeah.
if I
That,
correctly. So, yeah,
yeah,
let's
man.
unpack that just a little bit, like what the evolution of that cycle is and why why is that? Because you got a unique perspective being one of the first F-35B guys.
Yeah, and that's our roots, man. We call it TAC air integration, but that's naval aviation. In our core is Navy Marine pilots fly off ships, and we really have, forever, since carrier aviation was really a big thing. When I got into the fleet back in the late '90s, started flying Hornets. We had I can't remember how many, maybe 18 Hornet squadrons. We had a bunch of Hornet squadrons. Four of them were tethered to Navy air wings, and so really it was just to augment, to make sure the Navy had enough carrier-based squadrons to fill out the air wings on the deployment cycle. So, however many Hornet, Tomcat squadrons there were four Marine F-18 squadrons, two on the East Coast, two on the West Coast. So it's pretty rare to have a Marine flying off ships, but not totally unheard of, small percentage-wise. But we had been with the Navy flying Hornets off carriers, I think, since the early '80s, mid '80s. And that continued up until just a couple years ago when the last Hornet squadron did its last deployment. I think it was VMFE 323 just a couple years back. But just like you said, the smaller deck carriers, Harriers, and F-35Bs have been on small deck LHAs, etc., for decades and decades. But the Marine Corps has F-35Cs now, which is the naval variant, the carrier-based CV variant, and has two full-up squadrons, and will be more to integrate into big deck carrier aviation. We have two squadrons that are in the full-up workup cycle right now, which is awesome. So the Marine Corps, that's part of naval aviation. We love flying with the Navy. We love being part of that, and we love having the best squadron on the boat, which is pretty cool.
Well, all right. So, in all fairness, I'm always ragging on the F-35B because it gave the F-35 the canopy bow.
I
That was
hear
a
you,
big deal about
man.
a canopy bow, right? Right. But like,
Yeah.
turns out like everything lands inside that canopy bow. It seems like when you're out there fighting.
Yeah.
But like, what what do you think why the pivot? Because again, unless I'm mistaken, I've seen the Marine Corps saying, "Hey, we're actually going to buy more F-35Cs than planned versus the B model." Can you talk to me about maybe the limitations and the differences of the B versus the C and why
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, and listen, you're not going to hear me shy away from any of the criticisms about any of those things. I mean, I lived that stuff too. You asked early on, F-16 or F-18. Nobody gets into the F-16 and wishes they had a canopy bow like they did in the
Right.
Hornet.
Yeah.
That thing is awesome. And, obviously even, the Raptor doesn't have a canopy bow, which is great. Still, the view in the Raptor is not as good as the view in the
Yeah.
F-16. There's nothing like that. There's just, you know it better than anyone. That said, you're thinking about the F-35, the different variants, the B and the C. Obviously, the F-35 across the board, all three variants are much more similar than they are different. They're pretty much identical in terms of capability. Couple variations, but the B definitely had some. I wouldn't even call them limitations, but they had some very specific requirements that forced a couple things onto the airplane itself. And if you take the B and the C, the two variants that the Marine Corps flies, and you put them side by side, certainly on paper, you get some great advantage with the C. A ton of gas, like a ton of gas, some ridiculous amount, 20 something thousand pounds, more than anything else that's out there. You get that big extra wing for that coming aboard the ship, which means it's super efficient up at altitude, bigger payload. And so on paper, you've got these metrics that really make the C a great airplane, which is part of the reason why the Marine Corps has invested and is growing that investment in it to fly off the big deck carrier, which, as an instrument of national defense, man, the big deck carrier is really hard to beat. You want to be part of that. The B, and I'm not parochial, I'm not like parochial to the B. I will say the B has capability when you're looking in a world of like hyper flexibility, being able to operate in very austere places, being able to do things. There's just a demand in the 21st century to have a highly effective fifth gen stealth platform like the F-35 operate in very non-traditional ways, and that's the niche that the F-35B owns. And you don't want to measure like, oh, one jet's got more gas, it's got more payload. All true. It's where that thing can operate. So there are some offsettings to that, and I am a believer in all of the F-35s in general. But the thing that makes the B unique, there's pros and cons to that. I experienced that. I live that. The pros vastly outweigh the cons, but you're not wrong in some of those things that we're talking about. And the Marine Corps, I think, understands the need for having both of those different platforms and where they can operate.